Chapter 37, We depart for Europe. A misunderstanding arises between the captain and the surgeon. Through the scandalous aspersions of Cramplay, the captain dies. Cramplay tyrannises over the surgeon, who falls a victim for his cruelty. I am also ill-used. The ship strikes. The behavior of Cramplay and the seamen on that occasion. I get on shore, challenge the captain to single combat, am treacherously knocked down, wounded, and robbed. Now that I could return to my native country in a creditable way, I felt excessive pleasure in finding myself out of sight of that fatal island, which has been the grave of so many Europeans, and, as I was accommodated with everything to make the passage agreeable, I resolved to enjoy myself as much as the insolence of Cramplay would permit. This insidious slanderer had found means already to cause a misunderstanding between the surgeon and captain, who, by his age and infirmities, was rendered intolerably peevish, his disposition having also been soured by a long course of disappointments. He had a particular aversion to all young men, especially to surgeons, whom he considered unnecessary animals on board of a ship, and, in consequence of these sentiments, never consulted the doctor, notwithstanding his being seized with a violent fit of the gout and gravel, but applied to a cask of Holland gin, which was his sovereign prescription against all distempers. Whether he was at this time too sparing, or took an overdose of his cordial, certain it is, he departed in the night, without any ceremony, which indeed was a thing he always despised, and was found stiff next morning, to the no small satisfaction of Cramplay, who succeeded to the command of the vessel. For that very reason, Mr. Tomlins and I had no cause to rejoice at this event, fearing that the tyranny of our new commander would now be as unlimited as his power. The first day of his command justified our apprehensions, for, on pretence that the decks were too much crowded, he ordered the surgeon's hencoops, with all his fowls, to be thrown overboard, and at the same time prohibited him and me from walking on the quarter-deck. Mr. Tomlins could not help complaining of these injuries, and in the course of his expostulation dropped some hasty words, of which Cramplay taking hold, confined him to his cabin, where, in a few days, for want of air he was attacked by a fever, which soon put an end to his life, after he had made his will, by which he bequeathed all his estate, personal and real, to his sister, and left to me his watch and instruments as memorials of his friendship. I was penetrated with grief on this melancholy occasion, the more because there was nobody on board to whom I could communicate my sorrows, or of whom I could receive the least consolation or advice. Cramplay was so far from discovering the least remorse for his barbarity, at the news of the surgeon's death, that he insulted his memory in the most abusive manner, and affirmed he had poisoned himself out of pure fear, dreading to be brought to a court-martial for mutiny, for which reason he would not suffer the service of the dead to be read over his body before it was thrown overboard. Nothing but a speedy deliverance could have supported me under the brutal sway of this bashaw, who, to render my life more irksome, signified to my messmates a desire that I should be expelled from their society. This was no sooner hinted, than they granted his request, and I was fain to eat in a solitary manner by myself during the rest of the passage, which, however, soon drew to a period. We had been 7 weeks at sea, when the gunner told the captain that, by his reckoning, we must be in soundings, and desired he would order the lead to be heaved. Cramplay swore he did not know how to keep the ship's way, for we were not within 100 leagues of soundings, and therefore he would not give himself the trouble to cast the lead. Accordingly we continued our course all that afternoon and night, without shortening sail, although the gunner pretended to discover silly light, and next morning protested in form against the captain's conduct, for which he was put in confinement. We discovered no land all that day, and Cramplay was still so infatuated as to neglect sounding. But at 3 o'clock in the morning the ship struck, and remained fast on a sand bank. This accident alarmed the whole crew. The boat was immediately hoisted out, but as we could not discern which way the shore lay, we were obliged to wait for daylight. In the meantime, the wind increased, and the waves beat against the sloop with such violence, that we expected she would have gone to pieces. The gunner was released and consulted. He advised the captain to cut away the mast, in order to lighten her. This expedient was performed without success. The sailors, seeing things in a desperate situation, according to custom, broke up the chests belonging to the officers, dressed themselves in their clothes, drank their liquors without ceremony, and drunkenness, tumult, and confusion ensued. In the midst of this uproar, I went below to secure my own effects, and found the carpenter's mate hewing down the purser's cabin with his hatchet, whistling all the while with great composure. When I asked his intention in so doing, he replied, very calmly, "I only want to taste the purser's rum, that's all, master." At that instant the purser coming down, and seeing his effects going to wreck, complained bitterly of the injustice done to him, and asked the fellow what occasion he had for liquor when, in all likelihood, he would be in eternity in a few minutes. "All's one for that," said plunderer, "let us live while we can." "Miserable wretch that thou art," cried the purser, "what must be thy lot in another world, if thou deest in the commission of robbery?" "Why, hell, I suppose," replied the other, with great deliberation, while the purser fell on his knees, and begged of heaven that we might not all perish for the sake of Jonas. During this dialogue I clothed myself in my bed apparel, girded on my hanger, stuck my pistols, loaded, in my belt, disposed of all my valuable movables about my person, and came upon deck with a resolution of taking the first opportunity to get on shore, which, when the day broke, appeared at the distance of 3 miles ahead. Cramplay, finding his efforts to get the ship off ineffectual, determined to consult his own safety, by going into the boat, which he had no sooner done, than the ship's company followed so fast, that she would have sunk alongside, had not some one wiser than the rest cut the rope and put off. But before this happened, I had made several attempts to get in, and was always balked by the captain, who was so eager in excluding me, that he did not mind the endeavors of any other body. Enraged at this inhuman partiality, and seeing the rope cut, I pulled one of my pistols from my belt, and cocking it, swore I would shoot any man who would presume to obstruct my entrance. So saying, I leaped with my full exertion, and got on board of the boat with the loss of the skin of my shins. I chanced in my descent to overturn Cramplay, who no sooner got up than he struck at me several times with a cutlass, and ordered the men to throw me overboard, but they were too anxious about their own safety to mind what he said. Though the boat was very deeply loaded, and the sea terribly high, we made shift to get upon dry land in less than an hour after we parted from the sloop. As soon as I set my foot on terra firma, my indignation, which had boiled so long within me, broke out against Cramplay, whom I immediately challenged to single combat, presenting my pistols, that he might take his choice. He took one without hesitation, and, before I could cock the other, fired in my face, throwing the pistol after the shot. I felt myself stunned, and imagining the bullet had entered my brain, discharged mine as quick as possible, that I might not die unrevenged, then flying upon my antagonist, knocked out several of his 4 teeth with the butt end of the piece, and would certainly have made an end of him with that instrument, had he not disengaged himself, and seized his cutlass, which he had given to his servant when he received the pistol. Seeing him armed in this manner, I drew my hanger, and, having flung my pistol at his head, closed with him in a transport of fury, and thrust my weapon into his mouth, which it enlarged on one side to his ear. Whether the smart of this wound disconcerted him, or the unevenness of the ground made him reel, I know not, but he staggered some paces back. I followed close, and with one stroke cut the tendons of the back of his hand, upon which his cutlass dropped, and he remained defenseless. I know not with what cruelty my rage might have inspired me, if I had not at that instant been felled to the ground by a blow on the back part of my head, which deprived me of all sensation. In this deplorable situation, exposed to the rage of an incensed barbarian, and the rapine of an inhuman crew, I remained for some time, and whether any disputes arose among them during the state of my annihilation, I cannot pretend to determine, but in one particular they seem to have been unanimous, and acted with equal dexterity and dispatch, for when I recovered the use of my understanding, I found myself alone in a desolate place, stripped of my clothes, money, watch, buckles, and everything but my shoes, stockings, breeches and shirt. What a discovery must this have been to me, who, but an hour before, was worth 60 guineas in cash. I cursed the hour of my birth, the parents that gave me being, the sea that did not swallow me up, the poniard of the enemy, which could not find the way to my heart, the villainy of those who had left me in that miserable condition, and in the ecstasy of despair resolved to be still where I was, and perish. Chapter 38. I get up and crawl into a barn, where I am in danger of perishing, through the fear of the country people, their inhumanity. I am succored by a reputed witch, her story, her advice. She recommends me as a valet to a single lady, whose character she explains, but as I lay ruminating, my passion insensibly abated. I considered my situation in quite another light, from that in which it appeared to me at first, and the result of my deliberation was to rise if I could, and crawl to the next inhabited place for assistance. With some difficulty I got upon my legs, and having examined my body, found I had received no other injury than 2 large contused wounds, one on the fore and another on the hinder part of my head, which seemed to be occasioned by the same weapon, namely, the butt end of a pistol. I looked towards the sea, but could discern no remains of the ship, so that I concluded she was gone to pieces, and that those who remained in her had perished. But, as I afterwards learned, the gunner, who had more sagacity than Cramplay, observing that it was flood when he left her, and that she would probably float at high water, made no noise about getting on shore, but continued on deck, in hopes of bringing her safe into some harbor, after her commander should have deserted her, for which piece of service he expected, no doubt, to be handsomely rewarded. This scheme he accordingly executed, and was promised great things by the Admiralty for saving His Majesty's ship, but I never heard he reaped the fruits of his expectation. As for my own part, I directed my course towards a small cottage I perceived, and in the road picked up a seaman's old jacket, which I supposed the thief who dressed himself in my clothes had thrown away. This was a very comfortable acquisition to me, who was almost stiff with cold. I therefore put it on, and, as my natural heat revived, my wounds, which had left off bleeding, burst out afresh, so that, finding myself excessively exhausted, I was about to lie down in the fields, when I discovered a barn on my left hand, within a few yards of me. Thither I made shift to stagger, and finding the door open, went in, but saw nobody. However, I threw myself upon a truss of straw, hoping to be soon relieved by some person or other. I had not lain here many minutes, when I saw a countryman come in with a pitchfork in his hand, which he was upon the point of thrusting into the straw that concealed me, and in all probability would have done my business, had I not uttered a dreadful groan, after having essayed in vain to speak. This melancholy note alarmed the clown, who started back, and discovering a body all besmeared with blood, stood trembling, with the pitchfork extended before him, his hair bristling up, his eyes staring, his nostrils dilated, and his mouth wide open. At another time I should have been much diverted by this figure, which preserved the same attitude very near 10 minutes, during which time I made many unsuccessful efforts to implore his compassion and assistance, but my tongue failed me, and my language was only a repetition of groans. At length an old man arrived, who, seeing the other in such a posture, cried, "Mercy upon en! The Leeds bewitched! Why, Dick, beest thou beside thyself?" Dick, without moving his eyes from the object that terrified him, replied, "O Vather! Vather! Here be either the devil or a dead mon, I don't know which on, but a groans wundily." The father, whose eyesight was none of the best, pulled out his spectacles, and, having applied them to his nose, reconnoitred me over his son's shoulder, but no sooner did he behold me, than he was seized with a fit of shaking even more violent than Dick's, and, with a broken accent, addressed me thus: "In the name of the Vather, Zoon, and Holy Ghost, I charge you, and you bin Satan, to be gone to the Red Zen, but an you be a murdered mon, speak, that you may have a Christom burial." As I was not in a condition to satisfy him in this particular, he repeated his conjuration to no purpose, and they continued a good while in the agonies of fear. At length the father proposed that the son should draw nearer, and take a more distinct view of the apparition, but Dick was of opinion that his father should advance first, he being an old man past his labor, and, if he received any mischief, the loss would be the smaller, whereas he himself might escape, and be useful, in his generation. This prudential reason had no effect upon the senior, who still kept Dick between me and him. In the meantime I endeavored to raise one hand as a signal of distress, but had only strength sufficient to produce a rustling among the straw, which discomposed the young peasant so much, that he sprang out at the door, and overthrew his father in his flight. The old gentleman would not spend time in getting up, but crawled backwards like a crab, with great speed, till he had got over the threshold, mumbling exorcisms all the way. I was exceedingly mortified to find myself in danger of perishing through the ignorance and cowardice of these clowns, and felt my spirits decay apace, when an old woman entered the barn, followed by the two fugitives, and with great intrepidity advanced to the place where I lay, saying, "If it be the devil I fear and not, and for a dead mon a can do us no harm." When she saw my condition, she cried, "Here be no devil, but in your fool's head. Here be a poor miserable wretch bleeding to death, and if a dies, we must be at the charge of burying him, therefore, Dick, go fetch the old wheelbarrow and put an in, and carry en to Goodman Hodge's back door. He is more able than we to pay out money upon poor vagrants." Her advice was taken, and immediately put in execution. I was rolled to the other farmer's door, where I was tumbled out like a heap of dung, and should certainly have fallen a prey to the hogs, if my groans had not disturbed the family, and brought some of them out to view my situation. But Hodge resembled the Jew more than the Good Samaritan, and ordered me to be carried to the house of the parson, whose business it was to practice as well as to preach charity, observing that it was sufficient for him to pay his quota towards the maintenance of the poor belonging to his own parish. When I was set down at the vicar's gate, he fell into a mighty passion, and threatened to excommunicate him who sent, as well as those who brought me, unless they would move me immediately to another place. About this time I fainted with the fatigue I had undergone, and afterwards understood that I was bandied from door to door through a whole village, nobody having humanity enough to administer the least relief to me, until an old woman, who was suspected of witchcraft by the neighborhood, hearing of my distress, received me into her house, and, having dressed my wounds, brought me to myself with cordials of her own preparing. I was treated with great care and tenderness by this grave matron, who, after I had recovered some strength, desired to know the particulars of my last disaster. This piece of satisfaction I could not refuse to one who had saved my life, therefore related all my adventures without exaggeration or reserve. She seemed surprised at the vicissitudes I had undergone, and drew a happy presage of my future life from my past suffering, then launched out into the praise of adversity, with so much ardor and good sense, that I concluded she was a person who had seen better days, and conceived a longing desire to hear her story. She perceived my drift by some words I dropped, and smiling told me, there was nothing either entertaining or extraordinary in the course of her fortune, but, however, she would communicate it to me, in consideration of the confidence I had reposed in her. "It is of little consequence," said she, "to tell the names of my parents, who are dead many years ago. Let it suffice to assure you, they were wealthy, and had no other child than me, so that I was looked upon as heiress to a considerable estate, and teased with addresses on that account. Among the number of my admirers, there was a young gentleman of no fortune, whose sole dependence was on his promotion in the army, in which, at that time, he bore a lieutenant's commission. I conceived an affection for this amiable officer, which, in a short time, increased to a violent passion, and without entering into minute circumstances, married him privately. We had not enjoyed one another long in stolen interviews, when he was ordered with his regiment to Flanders, but, before he set out, it was agreed between us, that we should declare our marriage to my father by letter, and implore his pardon for the step we had taken without his approbation. This discovery was made while I was abroad visiting, and just as I was about to return home, I received a letter from my father, importing that, since I had acted so undutifully and meanly as to marry a beggar, without his privity or consent, to the disgrace of his family as well as the disappointment of his hopes, he renounced me to the miserable fate I had entailed upon myself, and charged me never to set foot within his doors again. This rigid sentence was confirmed by my mother, who, in a postscript, gave me to understand that her sentiments were exactly conformable to those of my father, and that I might save myself the trouble of making any applications, for her resolutions were unalterable. Thunderstruck with my evil fortune, I called a coach, and drove to my husband's lodgings, where I found him waiting the event of his letter. Though he could easily divine by my looks the issue of his declaration, he read with great steadiness the epistle I had received, and with a smile full of tenderness, which I shall never forget, embraced me, saying, I believe the good lady your mother might have spared herself the trouble of the last part of her postscript. Well, my dear Betty, you must lay aside all thoughts of a coach, till I can procure the command of a regiment. This unconcerned behavior, while it enabled me to support my reverse of fortune, at the same time endeared him to me the more, by convincing me of his disinterested views in espousing me. I was next day boarded in company with the wife of another officer, who had long been the friend and confidant of my husband, at a village not far from London, where they parted with us in the most melting manner, went to Flanders, and were killed in sight of one another at the Battle of the Wood. Why should I tire you with a description of our unutterable sorrow at the fatal news of this event, the remembrance of which now fills my aged eyes with tears? When our grief subsided a little, and reflection came to our aid, we found ourselves deserted by the whole world, and in danger of perishing by want, whereupon we made application for the pension, and were put upon the list. Then, vowing eternal friendship, sold our jewels and superfluous clothes, retired to this place, which is in the county of Sussex, bought this little house, where we lived many years in a solitary manner, indulging our mutual sorrow, till it pleased heaven to call away my companion 2 years ago, since which time I have lingered out an unhappy being, in hopes of a speedy dissolution, when I promise myself the eternal reward of all my cares. In the meantime, continued she, I must inform you of the character I bear among my neighbors. My conversation being different from that of the inhabitants of the village, my recluse way of life, my skill in curing distempers, which I acquired from books since I settled here, and lastly, my age having made the common people look upon me as something preternatural, and I am actually, at this hour, believed to be a witch. The parson of the parish, whose acquaintance I have not been at much pains to cultivate, taking umbrage at my supposed disrespect, has contributed not a little towards the confirmation of this opinion, by dropping certain hints to my prejudice among the vulgar, who are also very much scandalized at my entertaining this poor tabby cat with the collar about her neck, which was a favorite of my deceased companion. The whole behavior of this venerable person was so primitive, innocent, sensible, and humane, that I contracted a filial respect for her, and begged her advice with regard to my future conduct, as soon as I was in a condition to act for myself. She dissuaded me from a design I had formed of travelling to Lauder, in hopes of retrieving my clothes and pay, by returning to my ship, which by this time I read in the newspaper was safely arrived in the River Thames, because, said she, you run the hazard of being treated not only as a deserter in quitting the sloop, but also as a mutineer, in assaulting your commanding officer, to the malice of whose revenge you will moreover be exposed. She then promised to recommend me, as servant to a single lady of her acquaintance, who lived in the neighborhood with her nephew, who was a young fox hunter of great fortune, where I might be very happy, provided I could bear with the disposition and manners of my mistress, which were somewhat whimsical and particular. But, above all things, she counseled me to conceal my story, the knowledge of which would effectually poison my entertainment, for it was a maxim, among most people of condition, that no gentleman ought to be admitted into a family as a domestic, lest he become lazy and insolent. I was fain to embrace this humble proposal, because my affairs were desperate, and in a few days was hired by this lady, to serve in quality of her footman, having been represented by my hostess as a young man who was bred up to the sea by his relations against his will, and had suffered shipwreck, which had increased his disgust to that way of life so much, that he rather chose to go to service on shore, than enter himself on board of any other ship. Before I took possession of my new place, she gave me a sketch of my mistress's character, that I might know better how to regulate my conduct. Your lady, said she, is a maiden of 40 years, not so remarkable for her beauty as her learning and taste, which is famous all over the country. Indeed, she is a perfect female virtuoso, and so eager after the pursuit of knowledge that she neglects her person even to a degree of sluttishness. This negligence, together with her contempt of the male part of the creation, gives her nephew no great concern, as by these means he will probably keep her fortune, which is considerable in the family. He therefore permits her to live in her own way, which is something extraordinary, and gratifies her in all her whimsical desires. Her apartment is at some distance from the other inhabited parts of the house, and consists of a dining room, bedchamber, and study. She keeps a cook maid, a waiting woman, and footman, of her own, and seldom eats or converses with any of the family but her niece, who is a very lovely creature, and humours her aunt often to the prejudice of her own health by sitting up with her whole nights together, for your mistress is too much of a philosopher to be swayed by the custom of the world, and never sleeps nor eats like other people. Among other odd notions, she professes the principles of Rosicrucius, and believes the earth, air, and sea are inhabited by invisible beings, with whom it is possible for the human species to entertain correspondence and intimacy, on the easy condition of living chaste. As she hopes one day to be admitted into an acquaintance of this kind, she no sooner heard of me and my cat, than she paid me a visit, with a view, as she has since owned, to be introduced to my familiar, and was greatly mortified to find herself disappointed in her expectation. Being by this visionary turn of mind abstracted as it were from the world, she cannot advert to the common occurrences of life, and therefore is frequently so absent as to commit very strange mistakes and extravagancies, which you will do well to rectify and repair, as your prudence shall suggest. Chapter 39, My Reception by that lady. I become enamored of Narcissa, recount the particulars of my last misfortune, acquire the good opinion of my mistress, an account of the young squire. I am made acquainted with more particulars of Narcissa's situation, conceive a mortal hatred against Sir Timothy, examine my lady's library and performances, her extravagant behavior. Fraught with these useful instructions, I repaired to the place of her habitation, and was introduced by the waiting woman to the presence of my lady, who had not before seen me. She sat in her study, with one foot on the ground, and the other upon a high stool at some distance from her seat. Her sandy locks hung down, in a disorder I cannot call beautiful, from her head, which was deprived of its coif, for the benefit of scratching with one hand, while she held the stump of a pen in the other. Her forehead was high and wrinkled, her eyes were large, grey, and prominent, her nose was long, and aquiline, her mouth of vast capacity, her visage meagre and freckled, and her chin peaked like a shoemaker's paring knife. Her upper lip contained a large quantity of plain Spanish, which, by continual falling, had embroidered her neck, that was not naturally very white, and the breast of her gown, that flowed loose about her with a negligence that was truly poetic, discovering linen that was very fine, and, to all appearance, never washed but in Castalian streams. Around her lay heaps of books, globes, quadrants, telescopes, and other learned apparatus. Her snuff-box stood at her right hand, at her left hand lay her handkerchief, sufficiently used, and a convenience to spit in appeared on one side of her chair. She being in a reverie when we entered, the maid did not think proper to disturb her, so that we waited some minutes unobserved, during which time she bit the quills several times, altered her position, made many wry faces, and, at length, with an air of triumph, repeated aloud, "Nor dare teach immortal gods my rage oppose." Having committed her success to paper, she turned towards the door, and perceiving us, cried, "What's the matter?" "Here's the young man," replied my conductress, "whom Mrs. sagely recommended as a footman to your ladyship." On this information she stared in my face for a considerable time, and then asked my name, which I thought proper to conceal under that of John Brown. After having surveyed me with a curious eye, she broke out into, "Oh! Thou wast shipwrecked, I remember. Whether didst thou come on shore on the back of a whale or a dolphin?" To this I answered, I had swam ashore without any assistance. Then she demanded to know if I had ever been at the Hellespont, and swam from Sestus to Abydos. I replied in the negative, upon which she bade the maid order a suit of new livery for me, and instruct me in the articles of my duty, so she spit in her snuff-box, and wiped her nose with her cap, which lay on the table, instead of a handkerchief. We returned to the kitchen, where I was regaled by the maids, who seemed to vie with each other in expressing their regard for me, and from them I understood, that my business consisted in cleaning knives and forks, laying the cloth, waiting at table, carrying messages, and attending my lady when she went abroad. There was a very good suit of livery in the house, which had belonged to my predecessor deceased, and it fitted me exactly, so that there was no occasion for employing a tailor on my account. I had not been long equipped in this manner, when my lady's bell rung, upon which, I ran upstairs, and found her stalking about the room in her shift and under petticoat only. I would immediately have retired as became me, but she bade me come in, and air a clean shift for her, which operation I having performed with some backwardness, she put it on before me without any ceremony, and I verily believe was ignorant of my sex all that time, as being quite absorbed in contemplation. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon I was ordered to lay the cloth, and place 2 covers, which I understood were for my mistress and her niece, whom I had not as yet seen. Though I was not very dexterous at this work, I performed it pretty well for a beginner, and, when dinner was upon the table, saw my mistress approach, accompanied by the young lady, whose name for the present shall be Narcissa. So much sweetness appeared in the countenance and carriage of this amiable apparition, that my heart was captivated at first sight, and while dinner lasted, I gazed upon her without intermission. Her age seemed to be 17, her stature tall, her shape unexceptionable, her hair, that fell down upon her ivory neck in ringlets, black as jet, her arched eyebrows of the same color, her eyes piercing, yet tender, her lips of the consistence and hue of cherries, her complexion clear, delicate and healthy, her aspect noble, ingenuous, and humane, and the whole person so ravishingly delightful, that it was impossible for any creature endued with sensibility, to see without admiring, and admire without loving her to excess. I began to curse the servile station that placed me so far beneath the regard of this idol of my adoration. And yet I blessed my fate, that enabled me to enjoy daily the sight of so much perfection. When she spoke I listened with pleasure, but when she spoke to me, my soul was thrilled with an ecstasy of tumultuous joy. I was even so happy as to be the subject of their conversation, for Narcissa, having observed me, said to her aunt, "I see your new footman is come." Then addressing herself to me, asked, with ineffable complacency, if I was the person who had been so cruelly used by robbers. When I had satisfied her in this, she expressed a desire of knowing the other particulars of my fortune, both before and since my being shipwrecked. Hereupon, as Mrs. Sagely had counselled me, I told her that I had been bound apprentice to the master of a ship, contrary to my inclination, which ship had foundered at sea, that I and 4 more, who chanced to be on deck when she went down, made shift to swim to the shore, when my companions, after having overpowered me, stripped me to the shirt, and left me, as they imagined, dead of the wounds I received in my own defense. Then I related the circumstances of being found in a barn, with the inhuman treatment I met with from the country people and parson, the description of which, I perceived, drew tears from the charming creature's eyes. When I had finished my recital, my mistress said, "Ma foi. Le garçon est bien fait." To which opinion Narcissa assented, with a compliment to my understanding, in the same language, that flattered my vanity extremely. The conversation, among other subjects, turned upon the young squire, whom my lady inquired after under the title of the Savage, and was informed by her niece that he was still in bed, repairing the fatigue of last night's debauch, and recruiting strength and spirits to undergo a fox chase tomorrow morning, in company with Sir Timothy Thicket, Squire Bumper, and a great many other gentlemen of the same stamp, whom he had invited on that occasion. So that by daybreak the whole house would be in an uproar. This was a very disagreeable piece of news to the virtuoso, who protested she would stuff her ears with cotton when she went to bed, and take a dose of opium to make her sleep the more sound, that she might not be disturbed and distracted by the clamor of the brutes. When their dinner was over, I and my fellow servant sat down to ours in the kitchen, where I understood that Sir Timothy Thicket was a wealthy knight in the neighborhood, between whom and Narcissa a match had been projected by her brother, who promised at the same time to espouse Sir Timothy's sister, by which means, as their fortunes were pretty equal, the young ladies would be provided for, and their brothers be never the poorer, but that the ladies did not concur in the scheme, each of them entertaining a hearty contempt for the person allotted to her for a husband by this agreement. This information begot in me a mortal aversion to Sir Timothy, whom I looked upon as my rival, and cursed in my heart for his presumption. Next morning, by daybreak, being awakened by the noise of the hunters and hounds, I rose to view the cavalcade, and had a sight of my competitor, whose accomplishments, the estate excluded, did not seem brilliant enough to give me much uneasiness with respect to Narcissa, who, I flattered myself, was not to be won by such qualifications as he was master of, either as to person or mind. My mistress, notwithstanding her precaution, was so much disturbed by her nephew's company, that she did not rise till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so that I had an opportunity of examining her study at leisure, to which examination I was strongly prompted by my curiosity. Here I found 1,000 scraps of her own poetry, consisting of 3, 4, 10, 12, and 20 lines, on an infinity of subjects, which, as women inspired, she had begun, without constancy or capacity to bring to any degree of composition. But, what was very extraordinary in a female poet, there was not the least mention made of love in any of her performances. I counted fragments of 5 tragedies, the titles of which were The Stern Philosopher, The Double, The Sacrilegious Traitor, The Fall of Lucifer, and The Last Day. From whence I gathered that her disposition was gloomy, and her imagination delighted with objects of horror. Her library was composed of the best English historians, poets, and philosophers, of all the French critics and poets, and of a few books in Italian, chiefly poetry, at the head of which were Tasso and Ariosto, pretty much used. Besides these, translations of the classics into French, but not one book in Greek or Latin, a circumstance that discovered her ignorance in these languages. After having taken a full view of this collection, I retired, and at the usual time was preparing to lay the cloth, when I was told by the maid that her mistress was still in bed, and had been so affected with the notes of the hounds in the morning, that she actually believed herself a hare beset by the hunters, and begged a few greens to munch for breakfast. When I expressed my surprise in this unaccountable imagination, she gave me to understand that her lady was very much subject to whims of this nature, sometimes fancying herself an animal, sometimes a piece of furniture, during which conceited transformations it was very dangerous to come near her, especially when she represented a beast, for that lately, in the character of a cat, she had flown at her, and scratched her face in a terrible manner, that some months ago, she prophesied the general conflagration was at hand, and nothing would be able to quench it but her water, which therefore she kept so long, that her life was in danger, and she must needs have died of the retention, had they not found an expedient to make her evacuate, by kindling a bonfire under her chamber window and persuading her that the house was in flames, upon which, with great deliberation, she bade them bring all the tubs and vessels they could find to be filled for the preservation of the house, into one of which she immediately discharged the cause of her distemper. I was also informed that nothing contributed so much to the recovery of her reason as music, which was always administered on those occasions by Narcissa, who played perfectly well on the harpsichord, and to whom she, the maid, was just then going to intimate her aunt's disorder. She was no sooner gone than I was summoned by the bell to my lady's chamber, where I found her sitting squat on her hands on the floor, in the manner of puss when she listens to the outcries of her pursuers. When I appeared, she started up with an alarmed look, and sprang to the other side of the room to avoid me, whom, without doubt, she mistook for a beagle thirsting after her life. Perceiving her extreme confusion, I retired, and on the staircase met the adorable Narcissa coming up, to whom I imparted the situation of my mistress. She said not a word, but smiling with unspeakable grace, went into her aunt's apartment, and in a little time my ears were ravished with the efforts of her skill. She accompanied the instrument with a voice so sweet and melodious, that I did not wonder at the surprising change it produced on the spirits of my mistress, which composed to peace and sober reflection. About 7 o'clock, the hunters arrived with the skins of 2 foxes and 1 badger, carried before them as trophies of their success, and when they were about to sit down to dinner, or supper, Sir Timothy Thicket desired that Narcissa would honor the table with her presence, but this request, notwithstanding her brother's threats and entreaties, she refused, on pretence of attending her aunt, who was indisposed. So I enjoyed the satisfaction of seeing my rival mortified, but this disappointment made no great impression on him, who consoled himself with the bottle, of which the whole company became so enamored that, after a most horrid uproar of laughing, singing, swearing, and fighting, they were all carried to bed in a state of utter oblivion. My duty being altogether detached from the squire and his family, I led a pretty easy and comfortable life, drinking daily intoxicating draughts of love from the charms of Narcissa, which brightened on my contemplation every day more and more. Inglorious as my station was, I became blind to my own unworthiness, and even conceived hopes of one day enjoying this amiable creature, whose affability greatly encouraged these presumptuous thoughts. Chapter 40. My mistress is surprised at my learning, communicates her performances to me, I impart some of mine to her, am mortified at her faint praise, Narcissa approves of my conduct, I gain an involuntary conquest over the cookwench and dairymaid, their mutual resentment and insinuations, the jealousy of their lovers, during this season of love and tranquility, my muse, which had lain dormant so long, awoke, and produced several small performances on the subject of my flame. But as it concerned me nearly to remain undiscovered in my character and sentiments, I was under a necessity of mortifying my desire of praise, by confining my works to my own perusal and applause. In the meantime I strove to insinuate myself into the good opinion of both ladies, and succeeded so well, by my diligence and dutiful behavior, that in a little time I was at least a favorite servant, and frequently enjoyed the satisfaction of hearing myself mentioned in French and Italian, with some degree of warmth and surprise by the dear object of all my wishes, as a person who had so much of the gentleman in my appearance and discourse, that she could not for her soul treat me like a common lackey. My prudence and modesty were not long proof against these bewitching compliments. One day, while I waited at dinner, the conversation turned upon a knotty passage of Tasso's Jerusalem, which, it seems, had puzzled them both. After a great many unsatisfactory conjectures, my mistress, taking the book out of her pocket, turned up the place in question, and read the sentence over and over without success. At length, despairing of finding the author's meaning, she turned to me, saying, "Come hither, Bruno. Let us see what fortune will do for us. I will interpret to thee what goes before, and what follows this obscure paragraph, the particular words of which I will also explain, that thou mayst, by comparing one with another, guess the sense of that which perplexes us." I was too vain to let slip this opportunity of displaying my talents, therefore, without hesitation, read and explained the whole of that which had disconcerted them, to the utter astonishment of both. Narcissa's face and lovely neck were overspread with blushes, from which I drew a favorable opinion, while her aunt, after having stared at me a good while with a look of amazement, exclaimed, "In the name of heaven, who art thou?" I told her I had picked up a smattering of Italian, during a voyage up the Straits. At this explanation she shook her head, and observed that no smatterer could read as I had done. She then desired to know if I understood French. To which question I answered in the affirmative. She asked if I was acquainted with the Latin and Greek. I replied, "A little." "Oh ho," continued she, "and with philosophy and mathematics, I suppose." I owned I knew something of each. Then she repeated her stare and interrogation. I began to repent of my vanity, and in order to repair the fault I committed, said, it was not to be wondered at if I had a tolerable education, for learning was so cheap in my country, that every peasant was a scholar, but I hoped her ladyship would think my understanding no exception to my character. No, no, God forbid. But during the rest of the time they sat at table, they behaved with remarkable reserve. This alteration gave me great uneasiness, and I passed the night without sleep, in melancholy reflections on the vanity of young men, which prompts them to commit so many foolish actions, contrary to their own sober judgment. Next day, however, instead of profiting by this self-condemnation, I yielded still more to the dictates of the principle I had endeavored to chastise, and if fortune had not befriended me more than prudence could expect, I should have been treated with the contempt it deserved. After breakfast my lady, who was a true author, bade me follow her into the study, where she expressed herself thus: "Since you are so learned, you cannot be void of taste, therefore I am to desire your opinion of a small performance in poetry, which I lately composed. You must know that I have planned a tragedy, the subject of which shall be the murder of a prince before the altar, where he is busy at his devotions. After the deed is perpetrated, the regicide will harangue the people with the bloody dagger in his hand, and I have already composed a speech, which, I think, will suit the character extremely. Here it is. Then, taking up a scrap of paper, she read, with violent emphasis and gesture, as follows: Thus have I sent the simple king to hell. Without or coffin, shroud, or passing bell. To me what are divine and human laws? I court no sanction but my own applause. Rapes, robberies, treasons, yield my soul delight. And human carnage gratifies my sight. I drag the parent by the hoary hair, and toss the sprawling infant on the spear, while the fond mother's cries regale my ear. I fight, I vanquish, murder friends and foes, nor dare the immortal gods my rage oppose. Though I did great violence to my understanding in praising this unnatural rhapsody, I nevertheless extolled it as a production that of itself deserved immortal fame, and besought her ladyship to bless the world with the fruits of those uncommon talents heaven had bestowed upon her. She smiled with a look of self-complacency, and encouraged by the incense I had offered, communicated all her poetical works, which I applauded, one by one, with as little candor as I had shown at first. Satiated with my flattery, which I hope my situation justified, she could not in conscience refuse me an opportunity of shining in my turn, and, therefore, after a compliment to my nice discernment and taste, observed, that doubtless I must have produced something in that way myself, which she desired to see. This was temptation I could by no means resist. I own that while I was at college I wrote some detached pieces, at the desire of a friend who was in love, and at her request repeated the following verses, which indeed my love for Narcissa had inspired, on Celia. Playing on the harpsichord and singing. When Sappho struck the quivering wire, the throbbing breast was all on fire. And when she raised the vocal lay, the captive soul was charmed away. But had the nymph possessed with these thy softer, chaster, power to please, thy beauteous air of sprightly youth, thy native smiles of artless truth, the worm of grief had never preyed on the forsaken love-sick maid. Nor had she mourned a hapless flame, nor dashed on rocks her tender frame. My mistress paid me a cold compliment on the versification, which, she said, was elegant enough, but the subject beneath the pen of a true poet. I was extremely nettled at her indifference, and looked at Narcissa, who by this time had joined us, for her approbation, but she declined giving her opinion, protesting she was no judge of these matters, so that I was forced to retire very much balked in my expectation, which was generally a little too sanguine. In the afternoon, however, the waiting maid assured me that Narcissa had expressed her approbation of my performance with great warmth, and desired her to procure a copy of it as for herself, that she, Narcissa, might have an opportunity to peruse it at pleasure. I was elated to an extravagant pitch at this intelligence, and immediately transcribed a fair copy of my ode, which was carried to the dear charmer, together with another on the same subject, as follows: Thy fatal shaft unerring move. I bow before thine altar, love. I feel thou soft resistless flame glide swift through all my vital frame. For while I gaze my bosom glows, my blood in tides impetuous flows. Hope, fear, and joy alternate roll, and floods of transports whelm my soul. My faltering tongue attempts in vain in soothing murmurs to complain. My tongue some secret magic ties. My murmurs sink in broken sighs, condemned to nurse eternal care, and ever drop the silent tear. Unheard I mourn, unknown I sigh, unfriended live, unpitied die. Whether or not Narcissa discovered my passion, I could not learn from her behavior, which, though always benevolent to me, was henceforth more reserved and less cheerful. While my thoughts aspired to a sphere so far above me, I had unwittingly made a conquest of the cookwench and dairymaid, who became so jealous of each other that, if their sentiments had been refined by education, it is probable one or other of them would have had recourse to poison or steel to be avenged of her rival, but, as their minds were happily adapted to their humble station, their mutual enmity was confined to scolding and fistcuffs, in which exercise they were both well skilled. My good fortune did not long remain a secret, for it was disclosed by the frequent broils of these heroines, who kept no decorum in their encounters. The coachman and gardener, who paid their devoirs to my admirers, each to his respective choice, alarmed at my success, laid their heads together, in order to concert a plan of revenge, and the former, having been educated at the academy at Tottenham Court, undertook to challenge me to single combat. He accordingly, with many opprobrious invectives, bade me defiance, and offered to box me for 20 guineas. I told him that, although I believed myself a match for him even at that work, I would not descend so far below the dignity of a gentleman as to fight like a porter, but if he had anything to say to me, I was his man at blunderbuss, musket, pistol, sword, hatchet, spit, cleaver, fork, or needle. Nay, I swore, that should he give his tongue any more saucy liberties at my expense, I would crop his ears without any ceremony. This rhodomantade, delivered with a stern countenance and resolute tone, had the desired effect upon my antagonist, who, with some confusion, sneaked off, and gave his friend an account of his reception. The story, taking air among the servants, procured for me the title of Gentleman John, with which I was sometimes honored, even by my mistress and Narcissa, who had been informed of the whole affair by the chambermaid. In the meantime, the rival queens expressed their passion by all the ways in their power. The cook entertained me with choice bits, the dairymaid with strokings. The first would often encourage me to declare myself, by complimenting me upon my courage and learning, and observing, that if she had a husband like me, to maintain order and keep accounts, she could make a great deal of money, by setting up an eating-house in London for gentlemen's servants on board wages. The other courted my affection by showing her own importance, and telling me that many a substantial farmer in the neighborhood would be glad to marry her, but she was resolved to please her eye, if she should plague her heart. Then she would launch out into the praise of my proper person, and say, she was sure I would make a good husband, for I was very good-natured. I began to be uneasy at the importunities of these inamoratas, whom, at another time perhaps, I might have pleased without the disagreeable sauce of matrimony, but, at present, my whole soul was engrossed by Narcissa, and I could not bear the thoughts of doing anything derogatory to the passion I entertained for her. Chapter 41, Narcissa, being in danger from the brutality of Sir Timothy, is rescued by me, who revenge myself on my rival. I declare my passion, and retreat to the seaside, am surrounded by smugglers, and carried to Boulogne, find my uncle Lieutenant Bowling in great distress, and relieve him. Our conversation, at certain intervals my ambition would revive. I would despise myself for my tame resignation to my sordid fate, and revolve 100 schemes for assuming the character of a gentleman, to which I thought myself entitled by birth and education. In these fruitless suggestions time stole away unperceived, and I had already remained 8 months in the station of a footman, when an accident happened that put an end to my servitude, and, for the present, banished all hopes of succeeding in my love. Narcissa went one day to visit Miss Thicket, who lived with her brother within less than a mile of our house, and was persuaded to walk home in the cool of the evening, accompanied by Sir Timothy, who, having a good deal of the brute in him, was instigated to use some unbecoming familiarities with her, encouraged by the solitariness of a field through which they passed. The lovely creature was incensed at his rude behavior, for which she reproached him in such a manner that he lost all regard to decency, and actually offered violence to this pattern of innocence and beauty. But heaven would not suffer so much goodness to be violated, and sent me, who, passing by accident near the place, was alarmed with her cries, for her succor. What were the emotions of my soul, when I beheld Narcissa almost sinking beneath the brutal force of this satyr! I flew like lightning to her rescue, and he, perceiving me, quitted his prey, and drew his hanger to chastise my presumption. My indignation was too high to admit one thought of fear, so that, rushing upon him, I struck his weapon out of his hand, and used my cudgel so successfully that he fell to the ground, and lay, to all appearance, without sense. Then I turned to Narcissa, who had swooned, and sitting down by her, gently raised her head, and supported it on my bosom, while, with my hand around her waist, I kept her in that position. My soul was thrilled with tumultuous joy, at feeling the object of my dearest wishes within my arms, and, while she lay insensible, I could not refrain from applying my cheeks to hers, and ravishing a kiss. In a little time the blood began to revisit her face, she opened her enchanting eyes, and, having recollected her late situation, said, with a look full of tender acknowledgment, "Dear John, I am eternally obliged to you." So saying she made an effort to rise, in which I assisted her, and she proceeded to the house, leaning upon me all the way. I was 1,000 times tempted by this opportunity to declare my passion, but the dread of disobliging her restrained my tongue. We had not moved 100 paces from the scene of her distress, when I perceived Sir Timothy rise and walk homeward, a circumstance which, though it gave me some satisfaction, inasmuch as I thereby knew I had not killed him, filled me with just apprehension of his resentment, which I found myself in no condition to withstand, especially when I considered his intimacy with our squire, to whom I knew he could justify himself for what he had done, by imputing it to his love, and desiring his brother Bruin to take the same liberty with his sister, without any fear of offense. When we arrived at the house, Narcissa assured me she would exert all her influence in protecting me from the revenge of Thicket, and likewise engage her aunt in my favor. At the same time, pulling out her purse, offered it as a small consideration for the service I had done her. But I stood too much upon the punctilios of love to incur the least suspicion of being mercenary, and refused the present, by saying I had merited nothing by barely doing my duty. She seemed astonished at my disinterestedness, and blushed. I felt the same suffusion, and, with a downcast eye and broken accent, told her I had one request to make, which, if her generosity would grant, I should think myself fully recompensed, for an age of misery. She changed color at this preamble, and, with great confusion, replied, she hoped my good sense would hinder me from asking anything she was bound in honor to refuse, and therefore bade me signify my desire. Upon which I kneeled, and engaged to kiss her hand. She immediately, with an averted look, stretched it out. I imprinted on it an ardent kiss, and, bathing it with my tears, cried, "Dear madam, I am an unfortunate gentleman, and love you to distraction, but would have died 1,000 deaths rather than make this declaration under such a servile appearance, were I not determined to yield to the rigor of my fate, to fly from your bewitching presence, and bury my presumptuous passion in eternal silence." With these words I rose, and went away before she could recover her spirits so far as to make any reply. My first care was to go and consult Mrs. Sagely, with whom I had entertained a friendly correspondence ever since I left her house. When she understood my situation, the good woman, with real concern, condoled with me on my unhappy fate, and approved of my resolution to leave the country, as being perfectly well acquainted with the barbarous disposition of my rival, who, by this time, said she, has no doubt meditated a scheme of revenge. Indeed, I cannot see how you will be able to elude his vengeance. Being himself in the commission, he will immediately grant warrants for apprehending you, and, as almost all the people in this country are dependent on him or his friend, it will be impossible for you to find shelter among them. If you should be apprehended, he will commit you to jail, where you may possibly in great misery languish till the next assizes, and then be transported for assaulting a magistrate. While she thus warned me of my danger, we heard a knocking at the door, which threw us both into great consternation, as in all probability, it was occasioned by my pursuers, whereupon this generous old lady, putting 2 guineas into my hand, with tears in her eyes, bade me, for God's sake, get out at the back door and consult my safety as Providence should direct me. There was no time for deliberation. I followed her advice, and escaped by the benefit of a dark night to the seaside, where, while I ruminated on my next excursion, I was all of a sudden surrounded by armed men, who, having bound my hands and feet, bade me make no noise on pain of being shot, and carried me on board of a vessel, which I soon perceived to be a smuggling cutter. This discovery gave me some satisfaction at first, because I concluded myself safe from the resentment of Sir Timothy, but, when I found myself in the hands of ruffians, who threatened to execute me for a spy, I would have thought myself happily quit for a year's imprisonment, or even transportation. It was in vain for me to protest my innocence. I could not persuade them that I had taken a solitary walk to their haunt, at such an hour, merely for my own amusement, and I did not think it my interest to disclose the true cause of my retreat, because I was afraid they would have made their peace with justice by surrendering me to the penalty of the law. What confirmed their suspicion was the appearance of a custom-house yacht, which gave them chase, and had well nigh made a prize of their vessel, when they were delivered from their fears by a thick fog, which effectually screened them, and favored their arrival at Boulogne. But, before they got out of sight of their pursuer, they held a council of war about me, and some of the most ferocious among them would have thrown me overboard as a traitor who had betrayed them to their enemies, but others, more considerate, alleged, that if they put me to death, and should afterwards be taken, they could expect no mercy from the legislature, which would never pardon outlawry aggravated by murder. It was therefore determined by a plurality of votes, that I should be set on shore in France, and left to find my way back to England, as I should think proper, this being punishment sufficient for the bare suspicion of a crime in itself not capital. Although this favorable determination gave me great pleasure, the apprehension of being robbed would not suffer me to be perfectly at ease. To prevent this calamity, as soon as I was untied, in consequence of the aforesaid decision, I tore a small hole in one of my stockings, into which I dropped 6 guineas, reserving half a piece and some silver in my pocket, that, finding something, they might not be tempted to make any further inquiry. This was a very necessary precaution, for, when we came within sight of the French shore, one of the smugglers told me, I must pay for my passage. To this declaration I replied, that my passage was none of my own seeking, therefore they could not expect a reward from me for transporting me into a strange country by force. Me, said the outlaw, none of your palaver, but let me see what money you have got. So saying, he thrust his hand into my pocket without any ceremony, and emptied it of the contents, then, casting an eye at my hat and wig, which captivated his fancy, he took them off, clapping his own on my head, declared, that a fair exchange was no robbery. I was fain to put up with this bargain, which was by no means favorable to me, and a little while after we went all on shore together. I resolved to take my leave of those desperadoes without much ceremony, when one of them cautioned me against appearing to their prejudice if ever I returned to England, unless I had a mind to be murdered, for which service, he assured me, the gang never wanted agents. I promised to observe his advice, and departed for the upper town, where I inquired for a cabaret, or public house, into which I went, with an intention of taking some refreshment. In the kitchen, 5 Dutch sailors sat at breakfast with a large loaf, a firkin of butter, and a keg of brandy, the bung of which they often applied to their mouths with great perseverance and satisfaction. At some distance from them I perceived another person in the same garb, sitting in a pensive solitary manner, entertaining himself with a whiff of tobacco, from the stump of a pipe as black as jet. The appearance of distress never failed to attract my regard and compassion. I approached this forlorn tar with a view to offer him my assistance, and, notwithstanding the alteration of dress and disguise of a long beard, I discovered in him my long-lost and lamented uncle and benefactor, Lieutenant Bowling. Good heaven! What were the agitations of my soul, between the joy of finding again such a valuable friend, and the sorrow of seeing him in such a low condition. The tears gushed down my cheeks, I stood motionless and silent for some time. At length, recovering the use of speech, I exclaimed, Gracious God! Mr. Bowling! My uncle no sooner heard his name mentioned, than he started up, crying, with some surprise, Holla, and, after having looked at me steadfastly, without being able to recollect me, said, Did you call me, brother? I told him I had something extraordinary to communicate, and desired him to give me the hearing for a few minutes in another room, but he would by no means consent to this proposal, saying, Avast there, friend, none of your tricks upon travellers, if you have anything to say to me. Do it above board, you need not be afraid of being overheard, here are none who understand our lingo. Though I was loath to discover myself before company, I could no longer refrain from telling him I was his own nephew, Roderick Random. On this information, he considered me with great earnestness and astonishment, and, recalling my features, which, though enlarged, were not entirely altered since he had seen me, came up, and shook me by the hand very cordially, protesting he was glad to see me well. After some pause, he went on thus, "And yet, my lad, I am sorry to see you under such colors, the more so, as it is not in my power, at present, to change them for the better, times being very hard with me." With these words I could perceive a tear trickle down his furrowed cheek, which affected me so much that I wept bitterly. Imagining my sorrow was the effect of my own misfortunes, he comforted me with observing, that life was a voyage in which we must expect to meet with all weathers, sometimes was calm, sometimes rough, that a fair gale often succeeded a storm, that the wind did not always sit one way, and that despair signified nothing, that resolution and skill were better than a stout vessel, for why? Because they require no carpenter, and grow stronger the more labor they undergo. I dried up my tears, which I assured him were not shed for my own distress, but for his, and begged leave to accompany him into another room, where we could converse more at our ease. There I recounted to him the ungenerous usage I had met with from Potion, at which relation he started up, stalked across the room 3 or 4 times in a great hurry, and, grasping his cudgel, cried, "I would I were alongside of him, that's all, I would I were alongside of him." I then gave him a detail of my adventures and sufferings, which affected him more than I could have imagined, and concluded with telling him that Captain Oaken was still alive, and that he might return to England when he would to solicit his affairs, without danger or molestation. He was wonderfully pleased with this piece of information, of which, however, he said he could not at present avail himself, for want of money to pay for his passage to London. This objection I soon removed, by putting 5 guineas into his hand, and telling him I thought myself extremely happy in having an opportunity of manifesting my gratitude to him in his necessity. But it was with the utmost difficulty I could prevail upon him to accept of 2, which he affirmed were more than sufficient to defray the necessary expense. After this friendly contest was over, he proposed we should have a mess of something, for, said he, it has been banyan day with me a great while. You must know I was shipwrecked, 5 days ago, near a place called Lisieux, in company with those Dutchmen who are now drinking below, and having but little money when I came ashore, it was soon spent, because I let them have share and share while it lasted. Howsomever, I should have remembered the old saying, every hog his own apple, for when they found my hold unstowed, they went all hands to shoeling and begging, and, because I would not take a spell at the same duty, refused to give me the least assistance, so that I have not broke bread these 2 days. I was shocked at the extremity of his distress, and ordered some bread, cheese, and wine, to be brought immediately, to allay his hunger, until a fricassee of chickens could be prepared. When he had recruited his spirits with this homely fare, I desired to know the particulars of his peregrination since the accident at Cape Tiburon, which were briefly these: the money he had about him being all spent at Port Louis, the civility and hospitality of the French cooled to such a degree, that he was obliged to list on board one of their king's ships as a common foremast man, to prevent himself from starving on shore. In this situation he continued 2 years, during which time he had acquired some knowledge of their language, and the reputation of a good seaman. The ship he belonged to was ordered home to France, where she was laid up as unfit for service, and he was received on board one of Monsieur Danton's squadron, in quality of quartermaster, which office he performed in a voyage to the West Indies, where he engaged with our ship, as before related, but his conscience upbraiding him for serving the one. Enemies of his country, he quitted the ship at the same place where he first listed, and got to Curaçao in a Dutch vessel. There he bargained with a skipper, bound to Europe, to work for his passage to Holland, from whence he was in hopes of hearing from his friends in England, but was cast away, as he mentioned before, on the French coast, and must have been reduced to the necessity of travelling on foot to Holland, and begging for his subsistence on the road, or of entering on board of another French man of war, at the hazard of being treated as a deserter, if Providence had not sent me to his succor. And now, my lad, continued he, I think I shall steer my course directly to London, where I do not doubt of being replaced, and of having the R taken off me by the Lords of the Admiralty, to whom I intend to write a petition, setting forth my case. If I succeed, I shall have wherewithal to give you some assistance, because, when I left the ship, I had 2 years' pay due to me, therefore I desire to know whither you are bound, And besides, perhaps, I may have interest enough to procure a warrant appointing you surgeon's mate of the ship to which I shall belong, for the beadle of the Admiralty is my good friend, and he and one of the under clerks are sworn brothers, and that under clerk has a good deal to say with one of the upper clerks, who is very well known to the under secretary, who, upon his recommendation, I hope, will recommend my affair to the first secretary, and he again will speak to one of the lords in my behalf, so that you see I do not want friends to assist me on occasion. As for the fellow Cramplay, though I know him not, I am sure he is neither seaman nor officer, by what you have told me, or else he could never be so much mistaken in his reckoning, as to run the ship on shore on the coast of Sussex before he believed himself in soundings, neither, when that accident happened, would he have left the ship until she had been stove to pieces, especially when the tide was making, wherefore, by this time, I do suppose, he has been tried by a court-martial, and executed for his cowardice and misconduct. I could not help smiling at the description of my uncle's ladder, by which he proposed to climb to the attention of the Board of Admiralty, and, though I knew the world too well to confide in such dependence myself, I would not discourage him with doubts, but asked if he had no friend in London, who would advance a small sum of money to enable him to appear as he ought, and make a small present to the under-secretary, who might possibly dispatch his business the sooner on that account. He scratched his head, and after some recollection, replied, "Why, yes, I believe Daniel Whipcord, the ship chandler in Wapping, would not refuse me such a small matter. I know I can have what credit I want for lodging, liquor, and clothes, but as to money, I won't be positive. Had honest Block been living, I should not have been at loss." I was heartily sorry to find a worthy man so destitute of friends, when he had such need of them, and looked upon my own situation as less miserable than his, because I was better acquainted with the selfishness and roguery of mankind, consequently less liable to disappointment and imposition. Chapter 42. He takes his passage in a cutter for Deal. We are accosted by a priest, who proves to be a Scotchman, his profession on friendship. He is affronted by the lieutenant, who afterwards appeases him by submission. My uncle embarks. I am introduced by a priest to a Capuchin, in whose company I set out for Paris, the character of my fellow traveller, on adventure on the road. I am shocked at his behaviour. When our repast was ended, we walked down to the harbour, where we found a cutter that was to sail for Deal in the evening, and Mr. Bowling agreed for his passage. In the meantime, we sauntered about the town to satisfy our curiosity, our conversation turning on the subject of my designs, which were not as yet fixed. Neither can it be supposed that my mind was at ease, when I found myself reduced almost to extreme poverty, in the midst of foreigners, among whom I had not one acquaintance to advise or befriend me. My uncle was sensible of my forlorn condition, and pressed me to accompany him to England, where he did not doubt of finding some sort of provision for me, but besides the other reasons I had for avoiding that kingdom, I looked upon it, at this time, as the worst country in the universe for a poor honest man to live in, and therefore determined to remain in France, at all events. I was confirmed in this resolution by a reverend priest, who, passing by at this time, and overhearing us speak English, accosted us in the same language, telling us he was our countryman, and wishing it might be in his power to do us any service. We thanked this grave person for his courteous offer, and invited him to drink a glass with us, which he did not think proper to refuse, and we went altogether into a tavern of his recommending. After having drunk to our healths in a bumper of good Burgundy, he began to inquire into our situation, particularly the place of our nativity, which we no sooner named than he started up, and, wringing our hands with great fervour, shed a flood of tears, crying, "I come from the same part of the country. Perhaps you are my own relations." I was on my guard against his caresses, which I suspected very much, when I remembered the adventure of the money-dropper, but, without any appearance of diffidence, observed, that, as he was born in that part of the country, he must certainly know our families, which, howsoever mean our present appearance might be, were none of the most obscure or inconsiderable. Then I discovered our names, to which I found he was no stranger. He had known my grandfather personally, and, notwithstanding an absence of 50 years from Scotland, recounted so many particulars of the families in the neighbourhood, that my scruples were entirely removed, and I thought myself happy in his acquaintance. In the course of our conversation, I disclosed my condition without reserve, and displayed my talents to such advantage, that the old father looked upon me with admiration, and assured me, that, if I stayed in France, and listened to reason, I could not fail of making my fortune, to which he would contribute all in his power. My uncle began to be jealous of the priest's insinuation, and very abruptly declared, that if ever I should renounce my religion, he would break off all connection and correspondence with me, for it was his opinion, that no honest man would swerve from his principles in which he was bred, whether Turkish, Protestant, or Roman. The father, affronted at this declaration, with great vehemence began a long discourse, setting forth the danger of obstinacy, and shutting one's eyes against the light. He said, that ignorance would be no plea towards justification, when we had opportunities of being better informed, and, that, if the minds of people had not been open to conviction, the Christian religion could not have been propagated in the world, and we should now be in a state of pagan darkness and barbarity. He endeavored to prove, by some texts of Scripture and many quotations from the Fathers, that the Pope was the successor of Saint Peter, and vicar of Jesus Christ, that the Church of Rome was the true, holy, Catholic Church, and that the Protestant faith was an impious heresy and damnable schism, by which many millions of souls would suffer everlasting perdition. When he had finished his sermon, which I thought he pronounced with more zeal than discretion, he addressed himself to my uncle, desired to know his objections to what had been said. The lieutenant, whose attention had been wholly engrossed by his own affairs, took the pipe out of his mouth, and replied, "As for me, friend, D.C., I have no objection to what you say. It may be either truth or false, for what I know. I meddle with nobody's affairs but my own, the gunner to his linstock, and the steersman to the helm, as the saying is. I trust to no creed but the compass, and do unto every man as I would be done by, so that I defy the Pope, the devil, and the pretender, and hope to be saved as well as another." This association of persons gave great offense to the friar, who protested, in a mighty passion, that if Mr. Bowling had not been his countryman, he would have caused him to be imprisoned for his insolence. I ventured to disapprove of my uncle's rashness, and appease the old gentleman, by assuring him there was no offense intended by my kinsman, who, by this time sensible of his error, shook the injured party by the hand, and asked pardon for the freedom he had taken. Matters being amicably compromised, he invited us to come and see him in the afternoon at the convent to which he belonged, and took his leave for the present, when my uncle recommended it strongly to me to persevere in the religion of my forefathers, whatever advantages might propose to myself by a change, which could not fail of disgracing myself, and dishonoring my family. I assured him no consideration would induce me to forfeit his friendship and good opinion on that score, at which assurance he discovered great satisfaction, and put me in mind of dinner, which we immediately bespoke, and when it was ready, ate together. I imagined my acquaintance with the Scottish priest, if properly managed, might turn out to my advantage, and therefore resolved to cultivate it as much as I could. With this view we visited him at his convent, according to his invitation, where he treated us with wine and sweetmeats, and showed us everything that was remarkable in the monastery. Having been thus entertained, we took our leave, though not before I had promised to see him next day, and the time fixed for my uncle's embarking being come, I accompanied him to the harbor, and saw him on board. We parted not without tears, after we had embraced and wished one another all manner of prosperity, and he entreated me to write to him often, directing to Lieutenant Bowling, at the sign of the Union flag, near the Hermitage, London. I returned to the house in which we had met, where I passed the night in a very solitary manner, reflecting on the severity of my fate, and endeavoring to project some likely scheme of life for the future, but my invention failed me. I saw nothing but insurmountable difficulties in my way, and was ready to despair at the miserable prospect. That I might not, however, neglect any probable reason, I got up in the morning, and went directly to the father, whose advice and assistance I implored. He received me very kindly, and gave me to understand, that there was one way of life in which a person of my talents could not fail of making a great figure. I guessed his meaning, and told him, once for all, I was fully determined against any alteration in point of religion. Therefore if his proposal regarded the Church, he might save himself the trouble of explaining it. He shook his head and sighed, saying, "Ah, son, what a glorious prospect is here spoiled by your stubborn prejudice. Suffer yourself to be persuaded by reason, and consult your temporal welfare, as well as the concerns of your eternal soul. I can, by my interest, procure your admission as a novitiate to this convent, where I will superintend and direct you with a truly paternal affection." Then he launched out into the praises of a monastic life, which no noise disturbs, no cares molest, and no danger invades, where the heart is weaned from carnal attachments, the grosser appetite subdued and chastised, and the soul wafted to divine regions of philosophy and truth, on the wing of studious contemplation. But his eloquence was lost upon me, whom two considerations enabled to withstand his temptation, namely, my promise to my uncle, and my aversion to an ecclesiastical life, for as to the difference of religion, I looked upon it as a thing of too small moment to come in competition with a man's fortune. Finding me immovable on this head, he told me, he was more sorry than offended at my noncompliance, and still ready to employ his good offices in my behalf. "The same erroneous maxims," said he, "that obstruct your promotion in the church, will infallibly prevent your advancement in the army, but, if you can brook the condition of a servant, I am acquainted with some people of rank at Versailles, to whom I can give you letters of recommendation, that you may be entertained by some one of them in quality of maître d'hôtel, and I do not doubt that your qualifications will soon entitle you to a better provision." I embraced his offer with great eagerness, and he appointed me to come back in the afternoon, when he would not only give me letters, but likewise introduce me to a Capuchin of his acquaintance, who intended to set out for Paris next morning, in whose company I might travel, without being at the expense of 1 livre during the whole journey. This piece of good news gave me infinite pleasure. I acknowledged my obligation to the benevolent father in the most grateful expressions, and he performed his promise to a tittle, in delivering the letters, and making me acquainted with the Capuchin, with whom I departed next morning by break of day. It was not long before I discovered my fellow traveller to be a merry facetious fellow, who, notwithstanding his profession and appearance of mortification, loved good eating and drinking better than his rosary, and paid more adoration to a pretty girl than to the Virgin Mary, or Saint Genevieve. He was a thick brawny young man, with red eyebrows, a hook nose, a face covered with freckles, and his name was Frere Balthazar. His order did not permit him to wear linen, so that, having little occasion to undress himself, he was none of the cleanliest animals in the world, and his constitution was naturally so strongly scented that I always thought it convenient to keep to the windward of him in our march. As he was perfectly well known on the road, we fared sumptuously without any cost, and the fatigue of our journey was much alleviated by the good humor of my companion, who sang an infinite number of catches on the subjects of love and wine. We took up our lodging the first night at a peasant's house not far from Abbeville, where we were entertained with an excellent ragout, cooked by our landlord's daughters, one of whom was very handsome. After having eaten heartily and drank a sufficient quantity of small wine, we were conducted to a barn, where we found a couple of carpets spread upon clean straw for our reception. We had not lain in this situation above half an hour, when we heard somebody knock softly at the door, upon which Balthazar got up, and let in our host's 2 daughters, who wanted to have some private conversation with him in the dark. When they had whispered together some time, the Capuchin came to me, and asked if I was insensible to love, and so hard-hearted as to refuse a share of my bed to a pretty maid who had a tendre for me. I must own to my shame, that I suffered myself to be overcome by my passion, and with great eagerness seized the occasion, when I understood that the amiable Nanette was to be my bedfellow. In vain did my reason suggest the respect that I owed to my dear mistress Narcissa. The idea of that lovely charmer rather increased than allayed the ferment of my spirits, and the young paysan had no reason to complain of my remembrance. Early in the morning, the kind creatures left us to our repose, which lasted till 8 o'clock, when we got up, and were treated at breakfast with chocolate and eau de vie by our paramours, of whom we took a tender leave, after my companion had confessed and given them absolution. While we proceeded on our journey, the conversation turned upon the night's adventure, being introduced by the Capuchin, who asked me how I liked my lodging. I declared my satisfaction, and talked in rapture of the agreeable Nanette, at which he shook his head, and smiling said, "She was a morceau pour la bonne bouche." "I never valued myself," continued he, "upon anything so much as the conquest of Nanette, and, vanity apart, I have been pretty fortunate in my amours." This information shocked me not a little, as I was well convinced of his intimacy with her sister, and though I did not care to tax him with downright incest, I professed my astonishment at his last night's choice, when, I supposed, the other was at his devotion. To this hint he answered that, besides his natural complaisance to the sex, he had another reason to distribute his favors equally between them, namely, to preserve peace in the family, which could not otherwise be maintained, that, moreover, Nanette had conceived an affection for me, and he loved her too well to balk her inclination, more especially, when he had an opportunity of obliging his friend at the same time. I thanked him for this instance of his friendship, though I was extremely disgusted at his want of delicacy, and cursed the occasion that threw me in his way. Libertine as I was, I could not bear to see a man behave so wide of the character he assumed. I looked upon him as a person of very little worth or honesty, and should even have kept a wary eye upon my pocket, if I had thought he could have had any temptation to steal. But I could not conceive the use of money to a Capuchin, who is obliged, by the rules of his order, to appear like a beggar, and enjoy all other necessaries of life gratis. Besides, my fellow traveler seemed to be of a complexion too careless and sanguine to give me any apprehension on that score, so that I proceeded with great confidence, in expectation of being soon at my journey's end. Chapter 43. We lodge at a house near Amiens, where I am robbed by the Capuchin, who escapes while I am asleep. I go to Noyens in search of him, but without success, make my condition known to several people, but find no relief, grow desperate, find a company of soldiers, enlist in the regiment of Picardy. We are ordered into Germany. I find the fatigues of the march almost intolerable, quarrel with my comrade in a dispute about politics. He challenges me to the field, wounds and disarms me. The third night of our pilgrimage we passed at a house near Amiens, where being unknown, we supped upon indifferent fare and sour wine, and were fain to be in a garret upon an old mattress, which, I believe, had been in the possession of 10,000 myriads of fleas time out of mind. We did not invade their territory with impunity. In less than a minute we were attacked by stings innumerable, in spite of which, however, I fell fast asleep, being excessively fatigued with our day's march, and did not wake till 9 next morning, when, seeing myself alone, I started up in a terrible fright, and, examining my pockets, found my presaging fear too true. My companion had made free with my cash, and left me to seek my way to Paris by myself. I ran downstairs immediately, and, with a look full of grief and amazement, inquired for the mendicant, who, they gave me to understand, had set out 4 hours before, after having told them I was a little indisposed, and desired I might not be disturbed, but be informed when I should wake, that he had taken the road to Noyens, where he would wait for my coming, at the Coq d'Or. I spoke not a word, but with a heavy heart directed my course to that place, at which I arrived in the afternoon, fainting with weariness and hunger, but learned to my utter confusion, that no such person had been there. It was happy for me that I had a good deal of resentment in my constitution, which animated me on such occasions against the villainy of mankind, and enabled me to bear misfortunes, otherwise intolerable. Boiling with indignation, I discovered to the host my deplorable condition, and inveighed with great bitterness against the treachery of Balthazar, at which he shrugged up his shoulders, and with a peculiar grimace on his countenance, said, he was sorry for my misfortune, but there was no remedy like patience. At that instant some guests arrived, to whom he hastened to offer his service, leaving me mortified at his indifference, and fully persuaded that an innkeeper is the same sordid animal all the world over. While I stood in the porch forlorn and undetermined, venting ejaculations of curses against the thief who had robbed me, and the old priest who recommended him to my friendship, a young gentleman richly dressed, attended by a valet de chamber and 2 servants in livery, arrived at the inn. I thought I perceived a great deal of sweetness and good nature in his countenance, therefore he had no sooner alighted than I accosted him, and, in a few words, explained my situation. He listened with great politeness, and, when I made an end of my story, said, "Well, monsieur, what would you have me to do?" I was effectually abashed at this interrogation, which, I believe, no man of common sense or generosity could make, and made no other compliment than a low bow. He returned the compliment still lower, and tripped into an apartment, while the landlord let me know that my standing there to interrupt company gave offence, and might do him infinite prejudice. He had no occasion to repeat his insinuation. I moved from the place immediately, and was so much transported with grief, anger, and disdain, that a torrent of blood gushed from my nostrils. In this ecstasy, I quitted Noyons, and betook myself to the fields, where I wandered about like one distracted, till my spirits were quite exhausted, and I was obliged to throw myself down at the root of a tree, to rest my wearied limbs. Here my rage forsook me. I began to feel the importunate cravings of nature, and relapsed into silent sorrow and melancholy reflection. I revolved all the crimes I had been guilty of and found them too few and venial, that I could not comprehend the justice of that Providence, which, after having exposed me to so much wretchedness and danger, left me a prey to famine at last in a foreign country, where I had not one friend or acquaintance to close my eyes, and do the last offices of humanity to my miserable carcass. 1,000 times I wished myself a bear, that I might retreat to woods and deserts, far from the inhospitable haunts of man, where I could live by my own talents, independent of treacherous friends and supercilious scorn. As I lay in this manner, groaning over my hapless fate, I heard the sound of a violin, and raising my head, perceived a company of men and women dancing on the grass at some distance from me. I looked upon this to be a favorable season for distress to attract compassion, when every selfish thought is banished, and the heart dilated with mirth and social joy, wherefore I got up and approached those happy people, whom I soon discovered to be a party of soldiers, with their wives and children, unbending and diverting themselves at this rate, after the fatigue of a march. I had never before seen such a parcel of scarecrows together, neither could I reconcile their meagre and gaunt looks, their squalid and ragged attire, and every other external symptom of extreme woe, with this appearance of festivity. I saluted them, however, and was received with great politeness, after which they formed a ring, and danced around me. This jollity had a wonderful effect upon my spirits. I was infected with their gaiety, and in spite of my dismal situation, forgot my cares, and joined in their extravagance. When we had recreated ourselves a good while at this diversion, the ladies spread their manteaus on the ground, upon which they emptied their knapsacks of some onions, coarse bread, and a few flasks of poor wine. Being invited to a share of the banquet, I sat down with the rest, and, in the whole course of my life, never made a more comfortable meal. When our repast was ended, we got up again to dance, and, now that I found myself refreshed, I behaved to the admiration of everybody. I was loaded with 1,000 compliments and professions of friendship. The men commended my person and agility, and the women were loud in the praise of my bonne grace. The sergeant in particular expressed so much regard for me, and described the pleasures of a soldier's life to me with so much art, that I began to listen to his proposal of enlisting me in the service, and the more I considered my own condition, the more I was convinced of the necessity I was under to come to a speedy determination. Having, therefore, maturely weighed the circumstances pro and con, I signified my consent, and was admitted into the regiment of Picardy, said to be the oldest corps in Europe. The company to which this commander belonged was quartered at a village not far off, whither we marched next day, and I was presented to my captain, who seemed very well pleased with my appearance, gave me a crown to drink, and ordered me to be accommodated with clothes, arms, and accoutrements. Then I sold my livery suit, purchased linen, and, as I was at great pains to learn the exercise, in a very short time became a complete soldier. It was not long before we received orders to join several more regiments, and march with all expedition into Germany, in order to reinforce Mareschal Duc de Noailles, who was then encamped with his army on the side of the river Main, to watch the motions of the English, Hanoverians, Austrians, and Hessians, under the command of the Earl of Stair. We began our march accordingly, and then I became acquainted with that part of a soldier's life to which I had been hitherto a stranger. It is impossible to describe the hunger and thirst I sustained, and the fatigue I underwent in a march of so many 100 miles, during which, I was so much chafed with the heat and motion of my limbs, that in a very short time the inside of my thighs and legs were deprived of skin, and I proceeded in the utmost torture. This misfortune I owed to the plumpness of my constitution, which I cursed, and envied the withered condition of my comrades, whose bodies could not spare juice enough to supply a common issue, and were indeed proof against all manner of friction. The continual pain I felt made me fretful, and my peevishness was increased by the mortification of my pride in seeing those miserable wretches, whom a hard gale of wind would have scattered through the air like chaff, bear those toils with alacrity under which I was ready to sink. One day, while we enjoyed a halt, and the soldiers with their wives had gone out to dance, according to custom, my comrade stayed at home with me on pretence of friendship, and insulted me with his pity and consolation. He told me that, though I was young and tender at present, I should soon be seasoned to the service, and he did not doubt but I should have the honor to contribute in some measure to the glory of the king. "Have courage, therefore, my child," said he, "and pray to the good God, that you may be as happy as I am, who have had the honor of serving Louis the Great, and of receiving many wounds, in helping to establish his glory." When I looked upon the contemptible object that pronounced these words, I was amazed at the infatuation that possessed him, and could not help expressing my astonishment at the absurdity of a rational who thinks himself highly honored, in being permitted to encounter abject poverty, oppression, famine, disease, mutilation, and evident death merely to gratify the vicious ambition of a prince, by whom his sufferings were disregarded, and his name utterly unknown. I observed that, if his situation were the consequence of compulsion, I would praise his patience and fortitude in bearing his lot. If he had taken up arms in defense of his injured country, he was to be applauded for his patriotism, or if he had fled to this way of life as a refuge from a greater evil, he was justifiable in his own conscience, though I could have no notion of misery more extreme than he suffered, but to put his condition on the footing of conducing to the glory of his prince was no more than professing himself a desperate slave, who voluntarily underwent the utmost wretchedness and peril, and committed the most flagrant crimes, to suit the barbarous pride of a fellow creature, his superior in nothing but the power he derived from the submission of such wretches as him. The soldier was very much affronted at the liberty I took with his king, which, he said, nothing but my ignorance could excuse. He affirmed that the characters of princes were sacred, and ought not to be profaned by the censure of their subjects, who were bound by their allegiance to obey their commands, of what nature soever, without scruple or repining, and advised me to correct the rebellious principles I had imbibed among the English, who, for their insolence to their kings, were notorious all over the world, even to a proverb. In vindication of my countrymen, I repeated all the arguments commonly used to prove that every man has a natural right to liberty, that allegiance and protection are reciprocal, that, when the mutual tie is broken by the tyranny of the king, he is accountable to the people for his breach of contract, and subject to the penalties of the law, and that those insurrections of the English, which are branded with the name of rebellion by the slaves of arbitrary power, were no other than glorious efforts to rescue that independence which was their birthright, from the ravenous claws of usurping ambition. The Frenchman, provoked at the little deference I paid to the kingly name, lost all patience, and reproached me in such a manner that my temper forsook me. I clenched my fist, with an intention to give him a hearty box on the ear. Perceiving my design, he started back and demanded a parley, upon which I checked my indignation, and he gave me to understand that a Frenchman never forgave a blow. Therefore, if I were not weary of my life, I would do well to spare him that mortification, and do him the honor of measuring his sword with mine, like a gentleman. I took his advice and followed him to a field hard by, where indeed I was ashamed at the pitiful figure of my antagonist, who was a poor little shivering creature, decrepit with age, and blind of one eye. But I soon found the folly of judging from appearances, being at the second pass wounded in the sword hand, and immediately disarmed with such a jerk, that I thought the joint was dislocated. I was no less confounded than enraged at this event, especially as my adversary did not bear his success with all the moderation that might have been expected, for he insisted upon my asking pardon for affronting his king and him. This proposal I would by no means comply with, but told him, it was a mean condescension, which no gentleman in his circumstances ought to propose, nor any in my situation ought to perform, and that, if he persisted in his ungenerous demand, I would in my turn claim satisfaction with my musket, when we should be more upon a par than with the sword, of which he seemed so much master.